The vast chamber of the United Earth Coalition headquarters hummed with tense energy, a cacophony of whispered conversations and hurried footsteps echoing beneath the domed ceiling. The diplomatic hall, an impressive construction of glass and steel suspended high above the Atlantic, had never hosted such a critical assembly. Seated around a circular table of polished obsidian, representatives of Earth's most powerful nations braced themselves for the meeting that could decide the fate of their species. At the head of the table, Ambassador Elias Vance rubbed his temple, the weight of responsibility pressing against his skull. His dark hair, streaked with silver, was unkempt from too many sleepless nights. The message had arrived 48 hours ago. The Dominion was coming. Not with warships, not with plasma bombardments, but with a simple declaration: submit or be destroyed. The room quieted as the doors slid open with a whisper of hydraulics. Prince Kaler, a towering figure draped in the regal black and gold attire of the Dominion, strode forward with the grace of a predator. His sharp, angular features, a mark of his species' long lineage, held no expression, yet his piercing yellow eyes scanned the room with cold precision. Behind him, two Dominion warriors in midnight armor flanked his sides, their hands resting on the hilts of ceremonial energy blades. Vance rose to his feet, swallowing the bitter taste in his throat. "Prince Kaler," he said, keeping his voice steady, "on behalf of the United Earth Coalition, I welcome you to—" "Spare me the pleasantries, Ambassador." Kaler's voice was smooth, but edged with steel. He took his seat at the table, his warriors remaining standing. "You already know why I am here." Vance glanced at the other leaders before responding. Chancellor Wei, the representative of the Asian Alliance, sat with his fingers steepled in thought. President Geller of the North American Federation kept his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Across from them, Director Alzari of the Mars colonies adjusted her visor, her augmented cybernetic eyes flickering with unreadable calculations. None of them had spoken yet, waiting for him to lead. "We have received the Dominion's ultimatum," Vance said carefully, "and we understand what's at stake." Kaler leaned forward, the dim light catching the silver patterns etched into his dark skin. "Then you will make your decision." Vance inhaled slowly. The room felt too small, the air too thin. Humanity is not accustomed to surrender. Kaler tilted his head, the hint of a smirk ghosting across his lips. "Then you are accustomed to extinction?" A murmur of protest rippled through the room. Geller slammed his fist against the table. "We won't be threatened like this. We've fought for centuries to build a place among the stars. If the Dominion wants war, you'll lose." Kaler's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Your ships are crude. Your weapons outdated. Your fleets are scattered and inefficient. Humanity may be ambitious, but you lack the strength to defy the Dominion." Alzari's cybernetic eyes flickered. "Strength is not measured by numbers alone, Prince." Kaler exhaled through his nose, more amused than insulted. "I offer you survival, not servitude, but the chance to be part of something greater than yourselves. The Dominion does not seek your annihilation, only your obedience." Silence hung in the air. Vance studied the faces around the table. Wei's eyes were locked on the table's surface, deep in thought. Geller's knuckles had turned white from gripping the armrest of his chair. Alzari, unreadable as ever, remained still. Vance leaned forward. "What does this obedience entail?" Kaler folded his hands together. "Your governments will answer to the Dominion High Council. Your military will be integrated under our command. Your laws, your trade, your expansion beyond your homeworld, all will be overseen by our authority. And Earth itself," Kaler hesitated, "will be protected, cultivated, advanced beyond your own limitations." Geller scoffed. "You mean enslaved?" Vance ignored him. "And if we refuse?" Kaler's expression darkened. "Then your worlds will burn." A heavy silence followed. Then the doors burst open. A soldier in UEC military uniform rushed in, face pale, eyes wide with urgency. "Ambassador Vance, we've received an urgent transmission from the outer colonies." Vance turned sharply. "What is it?" The soldier hesitated, then handed him a datapad. Vance's fingers tightened around the device as he skimmed the report. His heart stuttered in his chest. The Freeborn had attacked. Kaler's gaze sharpened. What happened? Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing him the datapad. Kaler's golden eyes flickered over the words, his grip tightening. Explain this. His voice was dangerously low. Vance exhaled. The Freeborn are a rogue faction. They don't answer to Earth's leadership. We don't control them. They are human. Kaler's gaze burned. And they just massacred a Dominion outpost. Geller shifted uncomfortably. Maybe the Dominion shouldn't have put a military base so close to human territory. Kaler's hand curled into a fist. This is an act of war. No, Vance said sharply. This was an act of desperation by a group that doesn't speak for humanity. Kaler stood abruptly, his warriors stiffening at his side. It does not matter. The Dominion will not allow this to go unpunished. Your people have sealed their fate. Wei spoke for the first time, his voice level. Prince Kaler, surely we can find a diplomatic solution. There is no diplomacy left, Chancellor, Kaler snapped. Your kind had a choice. You have chosen blood. With that, he turned sharply and strode toward the doors. His guards followed, the Dominion envoy vanishing as swiftly as they had arrived. The room erupted into chaos. Geller cursed under his breath. Wei rubbed his temples. Alzari tapped her fingers against the table, calculating. Vance remained still, staring at the door where Kaler had disappeared. The fragile balance had shattered, and war had just begun. The Freeborn's attack had been swift, brutal, and absolute. What had once been a thriving Dominion outpost on the moon of Xiphos, 9 was now little more than charred wreckage, its defenses obliterated, its command structures reduced to smoking rubble. Thousands of Dominion personnel, soldiers, diplomats, engineers, had been killed in the onslaught. The attack was not one of conquest, nor negotiation. It was a declaration of war. From his place in the war chamber of the United Earth Coalition, Ambassador Elias Vance watched the grainy hollow footage of the destruction, the pit of dread in his stomach growing deeper with every frame. Burning towers, crushed Dominion vessels. The lifeless remains of alien civilians sprawled across the shattered colony roads. It was an atrocity, one that Earth's government had neither sanctioned nor supported. And yet, they would be the ones to pay for it. The room was silent, heavy with the weight of what had been done. The political leaders gathered in the chamber looked at one another, searching for answers, for scapegoats, for solutions that no longer existed. They've doomed us, Chancellor Wei murmured at last, his voice hollow. They may have just saved us, President Geller countered, though even he didn't sound convinced. The Dominion only respects strength. This attack shows them that we're not afraid. Vance turned toward him, barely concealing his anger. It shows them we're reckless, that we're willing to commit mass murder in the name of defiance. Do you think they'll hesitate to respond in kind? They were never going to let us negotiate, Geller argued. Kaler came here to dictate terms. That wasn't an offer. It was a warning. Director Alzari, her cybernetic eyes flickering, studied the footage with a detached calm. What matters now is what happens next. The Dominion will retaliate. The question is where and how hard. A sharp beep interrupted them as the chamber's communication panel flickered to life. A Dominion insignia, a crimson crest of interwoven rings, appeared above the table, followed by the flickering image of Prince Kaler. His golden eyes burned with cold fury. Ambassador Vance, he said, his voice taut with rage. We warned you. We offered you a path to survival. And this is how your people respond. Vance exhaled, keeping his expression unreadable. You know this wasn't Earth's doing. The Freeborn are extremists. They don't answer to the UEC. Kaler's lip curled. And yet they are human. Your people. Your responsibility. He leaned forward, the screen distorting slightly as he did. The High Council has reached its verdict. Earth has broken the fragile peace before it could begin. Your punishment will be swift. The screen flickered off. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the alarms began blaring. Incoming Dominion fleet detected. The war had begun. The Dominion fleet tore through the orbital defenses of New Berlin, the largest of Earth's outer colonies. Ships that had stood as proud symbols of human expansion burned within minutes, their hulls splitting apart like paper before the Dominion's superior weaponry. The colony's planetary shield held for only 17 minutes before it failed, leaving the surface exposed to the onslaught. General Raquel Ibarra, commander of the UEC Defense Forces, watched from the bridge of the UN Resolute as reports flooded in. Civilian casualties, critical infrastructure lost, entire sections of the colony going dark. "We need to evacuate the remaining civilians," Ibarra ordered, her voice tight. "Give me an open channel." The comms officer nodded, and a second later, her voice echoed across the remaining defense networks. "This is General Ibarra to all surviving units. Fall back to designated extraction points. Prioritize civilian transports. We are losing this battle." A nearby officer turned to her, face pale. "We can't just abandon New Berlin. We don't have a choice," Ibarra snapped. "We stay any longer, and we all die." On the surface, chaos reigned. Soldiers fought desperate battles in the streets, outgunned and outmatched. Civilians crammed into the last remaining transport ships, families torn apart in the frantic scramble to escape. In the skies above, UEC fighter squadrons were shredded by Dominion interceptors, their sleek, razor-like forms cutting through human defenses with terrifying efficiency. And then the orbital bombardment began. From high above the colony, Dominion warships fired concentrated energy lances down onto the surface. Entire city blocks vanished in an instant. The ground split apart, molten rock and dust spiraling into the atmosphere. It wasn't just a military strike. It was an execution, a message. By the time the last human transport ships escaped into deep space, New Berlin was no more. Back on Earth, the devastation of New Berlin sent shockwaves through every level of government. The attack had not been total annihilation, but it had come close. Dominion forces had left just enough survivors to spread the message. This was only the beginning. In the war chamber, Vance stood motionless as he watched the final moments of the colony play out on the display before him. Even the most hawkish members of the UEC government were silent now. There was no more arguing, no more debating. War was no longer a possibility. It was reality. Chancellor Wei exhaled slowly, his aged face weary. "We cannot win this," he murmured. "We need to negotiate." Geller shook his head, fists clenched. "Negotiate? After this? They won't stop. They'll keep pushing until we're under their boot." Vance turned toward him. "And what do you propose? More attacks? We couldn't even defend one colony against them." "There's another way," Alzari said suddenly. All eyes turned to her as she leaned forward, her cybernetic gaze scanning unseen data. "We need leverage. Something to force the Dominion to listen." Vance frowned. "And where do you suggest we find that?" She hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "The Freeborn," she said. Silence followed. Wei scowled. "You can't be serious." "I am," Alzari said simply. "Like it or not, they've just proved that humans can hurt the Dominion. We can use that." Vance shook his head. "They just dragged us into a war. You think they'll suddenly cooperate?" "They might," she said, "if they realize there's something bigger at stake." Vance stared at her. "And what, exactly, would that be?" Alzari's eyes flickered, her voice as cold as the void beyond the stars. "The Dominion isn't as invincible as they want us to believe." The UN Shadow Dancer sliced through the void like a phantom, her dark hull absorbing nearly all light from the nearby stars. The ship, a modified stealth cruiser, was built for infiltration and covert operations, exactly what this mission required. Ambassador Elias Vance sat strapped into his seat in the dimly lit war room aboard the vessel, his fingers drumming restlessly against the metal armrest. Across from him, Prince Kaler watched with an unreadable expression, his golden eyes sharp even in the low light. They were a most unlikely pair, one a diplomat forced into the role of a wartime negotiator, the other an imperial heir whose own faith in his people's dominance had begun to fracture. And yet, here they were, bound by the grim reality of survival. "We're coming up on the Freeborn's last known coordinates," came the voice of Captain Rourke over the ship's intercom. dropping out of slip space in 60 seconds. Vance exhaled, his mind already racing ahead. Convincing Kaler to come on this mission had been difficult enough. Convincing the Freeborn to cooperate would be damn near impossible. The Freeborn had long rejected both Earth's authority and the Dominion's rule, seeing themselves as the last true defenders of human sovereignty. They fought from the shadows, launching ambushes, targeting Dominion supply chains, and striking at key outposts. To them, war wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. The ship shuddered as it exited slip space. The view outside the main viewport shifted instantly from the swirling blue of hyperspace to the stark darkness of real space. Ahead of them, a cluster of jagged asteroids drifted lazily around a dying red star. Somewhere in that belt, the Freeborn's hidden fleet lay in wait. Kaler studied the asteroid field with mild interest. Your kind certainly enjoys hiding in the filth of space. Vance ignored him, pressing a calm switch. This is Ambassador Elias Vance of the United Earth Coalition. We request an audience with Commander Rand Aldrich. Silence. Vance exchanged a look with Kaler. Then, after a few tense seconds, a crackling voice responded. Turn back, UEC. You have no place here. Vance leaned forward. I'm not here on behalf of the UEC. I'm here to prevent the Dominion from wiping us all out. Another pause. Then a sudden burst of movement on the scanners. Ships emerging from the asteroids, sleek, angular warships painted in Freeborn crimson. They were smaller than Dominion vessels, but fast, maneuverable. Dangerous. Lower your shields and prepare to be escorted, the voice ordered. Vance met Kaler's gaze. The prince's lip curled, clearly displeased at the thought of allowing anyone, much less a rogue human faction, to dictate terms. Do it, Vance said. Kaler exhaled sharply, but nodded. Moments later, the ship's shields powered down, and two Freeborn interceptors flanked them, guiding them deeper into the asteroid field. The hangar bay of the FNB Vengeance, the Freeborn flagship, was a stark contrast to Dominion or UEC warships. There was no pomp, no polished steel or decorative banners. Everything was functional, scarred metal, exposed wiring, soldiers in battle-worn armor watching them with cold suspicion. At the center of it all stood Commander Rand Aldrich, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a long, tattered coat over his armor. Aldrich was a man forged in war. His face was lined with scars, his dark hair streaked with gray. But his most striking feature was his missing left eye, replaced by a crude, mechanical implant that glowed faintly red. You've got some nerve showing up here, Vance, Aldrich said, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze flicked to Kaler, and his lip curled in disgust. And you've brought one of them with you? I should have you both thrown out of an airlock. Vance stepped forward. We don't have time for theatrics, Run. You've made your point. You can hurt the Dominion. But you don't see the full picture. Aldrich narrowed his good eye. Enlighten me. Kaler, standing rigid beside Vance, spoke before the ambassador could. The Dominion is under attack. Aldrich scoffed. And I'm supposed to care? Kaler's expression remained cold. You should, because the enemy we face sees no difference between humans and the Dominion. To them, you are as expendable as we are. Aldrich frowned, but didn't speak. Vance pressed on. We have intelligence suggesting an unknown force is operating beyond Dominion space. They've been hitting their fleets, their communication lines. The Dominion is wounded. If we don't figure out who's behind this, we'll be next. Aldrich studied them both for a long moment. Then, he turned and gestured for them to follow. The war room of the Vengeance was cluttered with hollow projections, intercepted transmissions, and star maps covered in markings. Aldrich motioned toward a section of the display where several Dominion-controlled star systems were marked in red. These are Dominion outposts that have gone dark in the past month, Aldrich said. Not from us. Not from anyone we know. Kaler's jaw tightened. Your point. Aldrich turned to him. Whoever's doing this isn't just raiding. They're erasing. He tapped the controls, pulling up a series of grainy recordings. The footage showed Dominion ships, but something was wrong. A dark shape moved among them, a shifting mass of metal and shadow, striking so fast that entire Dominion warships simply vanished. No bodies, no debris, Just gone. Vance felt his skin go cold. What the hell is that? Aldrich exhaled. That's what we've been trying to figure out. Kaler's hands curled into fists. The High Council never mentioned this. Of course not, Aldrich said bitterly. They're too arrogant to admit they're vulnerable. Vance turned to Kaler. Do you believe me now? Kaler's face was unreadable, but the weight behind his gaze was undeniable. He turned back to Aldrich. What do you need? Aldrich raised a brow. You offering help, Prince? Kaler met his gaze evenly. I'm offering survival. Aldrich studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Then let's find out what we're up against. The war room aboard the FNB Vengeance was silent, the flickering holograms casting eerie blue light across the grim faces gathered around the central display. Ambassador Elias Vance, Prince Kaler, and Commander Wren Aldrich stood shoulder to shoulder, reviewing the Freeborn's intelligence, grainy footage, distorted transmissions, and maps riddled with disappearing Dominion outposts. The enemy they had feared was not a political force, not an empire or a rebellion. It was something else entirely, something inhuman. Kaler's golden eyes flicked over the data, his jaw tight. This is impossible. Aldrich scoffed, arms crossed. That's what I thought, too, until we started piecing it together. He gestured to the display. Whatever's doing this isn't just attacking. It's erasing. Dominion fleets, stations, entire colonies gone without a trace. Vance studied the recordings carefully. The shapes that moved through space weren't ships in any traditional sense. They were shifting constructs, dark forms that seemed to pulse with eerie, unnatural energy. They struck fast, and when they did, they left nothing behind. Vance exhaled. How long has this been happening? Aldrich tapped the console, pulling up a timeline of disappearances. The first incidents started about 6 months ago. Dominion patrols reported strange anomalies in deep space. Then, entire fleets stopped responding. We assumed it was some internal Dominion conflict, but when we intercepted their emergency transmissions, he turned toward Kaler. Well, it turns out even your empire gets scared. Kaler stiffened, but said nothing. His people prided themselves on being undefeated, the apex force of the galaxy. But the evidence before them told a different story. This doesn't make sense, Kaler murmured, shaking his head. If the Dominion was truly under siege, why wouldn't the High Council mobilize the full fleet? Aldrich chuckled darkly. That's what happens when your leaders are too arrogant to admit weakness. They thought they could handle it alone. He gestured to the map. Instead, they lost entire sectors without a fight. Kaler clenched his fists. And they still haven't acknowledged this? They can't, Aldrich said simply. If they admit there's an enemy they can't control, their empire crumbles. Vance folded his arms. Then it's worse than I thought. He turned to Aldrich. Do we have any confirmed survivors? Aldrich hesitated. Just one. The room fell silent. Kaler narrowed his eyes. Where? Aldrich brought up a star chart. A red marker blinked in the void of deep space. The derelict zone, he said, an abandoned Dominion outpost on the edge of known space. It was one of the first colonies to go dark. A few days ago, we picked up a distress signal. Vance frowned. From who? Aldrich exhaled. A Dominion officer. Claims to have seen what happened. Kaler straightened. You're saying a Dominion soldier survived an encounter with these things? Aldrich nodded. And if we want to understand what we're facing, we need to get to him before it's too late. The Shadow Dancer streaked through slipspace, its engines burning cold as it approached the dead world known as VYR Hal Station. Once a thriving Dominion colony, it now drifted lifeless in orbit around a pale blue gas giant. The only sign of activity was the faint distress beacon still pulsing from its surface. Vance stood on the bridge beside Captain Rourke, watching the station grow larger in the viewport. Any signs of activity? Rourke shook his head. Nothing but static. Vance turned to Kaler, who was suited in his Dominion battle armor, the deep black plating glinting under the dim lights. The prince had said little since the mission began, his mind clearly troubled by the implications of what they had seen. Kaler finally spoke. I recognized this station. His voice was quiet, but heavy. It was a scientific outpost, one of our research divisions. Vance glanced at him. Researching what? Kaler hesitated, then admitted, weapons. Aldrich, sitting on a nearby bench, let out a bitter laugh. Of course. Vance sighed. Well, let's hope their experiments didn't create the thing we're dealing with. The ship docked at the station's outer airlock, its metal frame creaking as it adjusted to the pressure. The landing bay was in complete darkness. Only the faint emergency lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the hangar. As the airlock doors slid open, the team stepped forward. Vance, Kaler, Aldrich, and 3 Freeborn soldiers armed with plasma rifles. Kaler took point, his Dominion energy blade humming softly as he activated it. Stay close. If something moves, kill it. The hallways of the station were eerily silent, save for the distant hum of failing machinery. Walls were scorched with plasma burns. The bodies of Dominion scientists and soldiers littered the floor, frozen in expressions of horror. One of the Freeborn soldiers swore under his breath. What the hell happened here? Then they heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from deeper within the station. Kaler signaled for silence, his golden eyes scanning the corridor. Vance's pulse quickened. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was something moving. They pressed forward, stepping over corpses, past shattered terminals and blood-streaked walls. Then, at the very end of the hallway, they found the survivor. A single Dominion officer, barely clinging to life. His armor was cracked, his breathing ragged. His dark skin was marred by strange, black veins, pulsing beneath his flesh. When he looked up at them, his eyes were glowing faintly blue. Kaler rushed forward, kneeling beside him. Who did this to you? The officer's lips trembled. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, distant. They are not alive. His hands clenched against the cold floor. They devour. Aldrich stepped closer. What are you talking about? The officer's breath hitched. They were waiting, in the void, watching us for centuries. His glazed eyes locked onto Kaler. We woke them up. Then, his body convulsed violently, and before anyone could react, his chest split open. A mass of black, writhing tendrils erupted from within him, lunging toward Kaler. The prince barely had time to react, rolling backward as the monstrous form twisted and expanded, shrinking the corridor into darkness. The Null had arrived. The corridor exploded into chaos. Tendrils of writhing black mass lashed out, striking the walls and ceiling, sending metal fragments and broken wires cascading to the ground. Kaler, his energy blade ignited, barely dodged the first attack, rolling to the side as the monstrous form twisted and expanded, filling the corridor with its shifting, pulsing mass. Vance staggered back, reaching for his weapon. The Dominion officer's body had been consumed, the thing that had erupted from him growing larger, feeding off the station's failing power grid. The Freeborn soldiers opened fire, plasma bolts searing through the dark tendrils, but the creature didn't stop. The wounds closed as fast as they appeared. Aldrich cursed. Fall back. Now! Kaler snarled, slashing at the thing with his energy blade, but it was like cutting through water. Each strike met no resistance, the tendrils parting and reforming as if mocking him. Vance grabbed Aldrich by the arm and yanked him toward the exit. We need to get out of here. Kaler leapt back as another tendril struck where he had been standing a moment before, splitting the metal floor open like paper. He pressed a control on his gauntlet, activating his comm. Shadow Dane, sir. Emergency evac now. The creature let out a horrific, echoing shriek, its form shifting, bulging, splitting into more shapes, more writhing masses. It wasn't just one entity. It was many, and it was waking up. The team sprinted through the collapsing station, alarms blaring around them. The thing that had emerged from the Dominion officer wasn't alone. More shapes moved in the darkness, creeping along the station's walls, slithering through the vents. They had awakened something ancient, something that had been waiting. They reached the airlock just as the Shadow Dancer swooped down toward the landing bay, its engines glowing. The ship's side doors slammed open, and Captain Rourke leaned out, waving them forward. Move, move, move. Kaler was the last aboard, turning just in time to see the creatures pouring out of the station's corridors, shifting masses of darkness, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as if they were not fully bound by reality. Rourke hit the thrusters, and a ship rocketed out of the station, just as the thing inside erupted outward, tendrils stretching into space, reaching for them. Vance watched through the viewport, his heart hammering. The station structure was collapsing, the entities inside spreading, expanding, growing stronger. Aldrich exhaled. Tell me I'm not the only one thinking we should leave this sector and never come back. Kaler's golden eyes were locked on the writhing horror below them. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. No, we have to go back. The briefing room aboard the Shadow Dancer was silent as the team reviewed the footage from VYR Hal Station. Vance sat with his hands clasped, his mind racing. Aldrich leaned against the wall, his mechanical eye flickering as he scanned through the data. Kaler stood with his arms folded, his face unreadable. These things, Aldrich muttered, they're not just some random alien species. There's something else. Something older. Vance exhaled. We need to figure out what they are. Kaler's voice was quiet. I already know. Everyone turned toward him. Kaler looked at the display, his expression grim. In Dominion archives, there's a legend. A story of an ancient war, long before my people ruled the stars. A war against something we only call the Null. Aldrich frowned. The Null. Kaler nodded. According to the records, they were not a species. Not an empire. They were the end. His voice darkened. They consume. They erase. They do not conquer because they do not need to. They simply unmake. Vance rubbed his temples. And your people knew about this? Kaler hesitated. We thought they were gone. Extinct. The last record of their existence was from over 100,000 years ago. He clenched his fists. We were wrong. Aldrich crossed his arms. So what the hell do we do now? Vance leaned forward. We have to go back to the Dominion. We need their fleets. Their technology. If we don't stop this now, there won't be a war anymore. He met Kaler's gaze. There won't be anything. Kaler's face was unreadable for a long moment. Then he nodded. I will take you to my father. The Dominion throne world of Valkar Prime was a fortress planet, a world of towering spires and fleets so massive they blotted out the sky. Vance and Aldrich stood beside Kaler as they entered the Imperial Citadel, where the Dominion High Council waited. Emperor Zealer, Kaler's father, sat upon the black throne, his piercing yellow eyes filled with suspicion. You return to us with humans? He said coldly, looking at his son. Have you lost your mind? Kaler stepped forward, standing tall. Father, listen to me. Our empire is in danger. The Null have returned. The room fell into stunned silence. A moment later, one of the counselors sneered. A child's tale. Nothing more. Kaler's golden eyes burned. Then explain why entire Dominion sectors are vanishing. He gestured toward the hollow display. These are your ships, your stations, your people, all gone. The Emperor's expression remained unreadable. But when he finally spoke, his voice was low. What do you propose? Kaler took a deep breath. An alliance. Humans, Dominion, Freeborn, everyone. If we do not stand together, we will fall alone. The chamber was silent. Then, slowly, the Emperor nodded. Then we fight. The Dominion fleet, the uneasy forces, and the Freeborn armada stood together for the first time in history. Thousands of ships formed a vast line against the darkness, weapons primed, engines burning. And then the Null arrived. A great void tore open before them, and from it emerged the nightmare. A fleet not made of ships, but of shifting, consuming horrors. The battle erupted in a storm of plasma fire, missiles, and burning debris. Entire warships were consumed in seconds as the Null tore through reality itself. Kaler led the charge, his personal warship slicing through the enemy ranks. Aldrich commanded the Freeborn's guerrilla strike teams, while Vance coordinated the desperate last stand. It was chaos. It was war. It was the end of everything. But humanity fought. The Dominion fought. And in the heart of the storm, Kaler, Vance, and Aldrich launched the final assault, striking deep into the Null's core mind, shutting down its link, breaking its power. The Null collapsed, their forms unraveling, consumed by their own hunger. And as the last of them faded into the void, silence fell over the battlefield. They had won, but the galaxy would never be the same.